A lone hunter, haunted by war, rescues a dying woman from a pack of wolves. But what he doesn't know is, saving her was the easy part. By dawn, the town will turn against him, the mountains will bleed, and the cabin he built to escape the world will become the last line of defense against it. Beneath the biting wind of the San Juan Mountains, the land slept under a shroud of white, vast, wild, and godless. It was the kind of silence that didn't comfort. It crushed. It hung in the air like a held breath, as if the earth itself was waiting for something unspeakable to happen. And high above the forgotten mining town of Silverton, where the sky pressed low and time moved like frozen molasses, a man lived alone in a cabin stitched together by splinters, sweat, and solitude. Jack Remington wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from something worse. Himself. He had fought in wars most men only heard whispered about, in places not marked on maps, where the rules of decency had long since frozen and shattered. Whatever had once lived behind his eyes had burned out long ago, leaving behind only grit and reflexes. Out here, among the trees and snow, he didn't need a name. He didn't need a future. He had a fire, a rifle, and a roof that didn't always leak. He thought that was enough. But something was coming. The fire crackled in the hearth that night, restless and uneasy, as if it too sensed the air shifting. Jack sat near it, skin raw from cold in the day's hunt, hands busy sharpening a blade already too sharp. He didn't hear the first scream. He felt it, like a nail dragged down the inside of his spine. He froze. The sound came again, high and ragged, torn from the throat of someone who had already begun to die. Not an animal, not a wolf. This was human. Jack grabbed his rifle. No coat, no gloves, just instinct. The door flung open like it feared being in the way. Snow lashed at him, slicing his skin with ice-sharp fingers. He ran. Boots cracked the crust of snow, breath turning to smoke. The scream had come from the ravine. He almost didn't see them. Wolves. 5, maybe 6, circling something barely visible in the drifts. A dark, crumpled figure. The wolves snarled, gaunt and feral, their ribs casting shadows under the moonlight. One lunged. Jack fired. The crack of the shot shattered the stillness. Wolves scattered, melting into the trees like mist. He stumbled forward, heart slamming against his ribs. It was a woman, barely more than a girl, skin the color of sun-warmed earth, now drained and frozen. Her hair, black as pitch, was tangled in her bloodied hands. Her face was bruised, lips blue. Torn fabric clung to her like a last prayer. She wasn't moving. He dropped to his knees. "Hey, hey, stay with me," he rasped, voice broken from weeks without use. Her eyelids fluttered. Once. Barely. Her breath fogged the air, thin, shallow, almost gone. Jack didn't think. He acted. He scooped her up, holding her to his chest. She was weightless. He could feel her bones beneath his grip, feel her warmth bleeding out. The cold didn't matter. The dark didn't matter, only getting her back. Back to the cabin. He kicked the door open, steam billowing from his breath as he laid her near the fire. She didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. He peeled off her frozen boots, wrapped her in every blanket he owned. The gash on her side was deep, jagged. He didn't know if it had been the wolves or something before. He didn't ask. He boiled water, found the dried herbs he'd never used, muttered curses as his shaking hands worked to stop the bleeding. The fire spit and snapped, shadows dancing across the cabin walls. The woman's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that made Jack grind his teeth. Too slow, too fragile. He sat there through the night, eyes never leaving her, not even to sleep. Outside, the wolves howled, long, low, mournful. Not for her, for what they'd been denied. Inside, the silence was louder. Every crackle of the fire was a question. Every breath she took, a coin tossed at fate. Who was she? What had she fled from? And what storm had he just stepped into? Jack Remington had built this cabin to escape, but tonight something had come knocking. Not death, something worse. A beginning. Morning came with a dull ache that seeped through the walls. Outside, the snow glowed with the soft silver of early light, but inside Jack Remington's cabin, the air was thick with the quiet gravity of survival. The fire had burned low in the hearth, its embers pulsing like the last beats of a dying heart. Jack hadn't slept. He couldn't. Not with the stranger lying under his roof, wrapped in every scrap of warmth he could find, hovering somewhere between death and return. The woman hadn't moved much during the night. A few shallow breaths. A twitch when the wind cried too sharply. Jack watched her from his stool near the fire, the rifle leaning within arm's reach. Not out of distrust, but out of instinct. He was a man forged in blood and silence, and trust didn't come easy. As light spilled through the frosted window pane, her eyes flickered open. Dark, deep, unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She stared at him as if trying to decide if he was real or just another vision sent by the fever clawing through her veins. "You're safe," Jack said, his voice gravelly from disuse. It wasn't reassurance. It was a statement of fact. She blinked slowly. Her gaze drifted around the cabin, the stone hearth, the rough-hewn table, the rifle, and then settled back on him. "Leia," she said. Jack's brow lifted slightly, then he gave a single nod. "Jack." The names sat between them like a truce signed in ash and fire. He poured a tin cup of water, warm from the kettle, and handed it to her. She sipped slowly, both hands trembling. Her lips were cracked, bloodied at the edges. He didn't ask where she'd come from or what had happened. Not yet. The answers didn't matter as much as the fact that she was still breathing. That first day passed in cautious rhythm. Jack busied himself with small tasks, splitting wood, checking traps, fixing a leak in the roof that had never mattered before. He stole glances at her, not out of suspicion, but out of something harder to define. She was alert, watching him move through the cabin like a creature learning the perimeter of its cage. There was strength in her silence. Not fear, not submission, just guarded endurance. She slept often, but when she woke, she helped, or tried to. Her hands, though still trembling, had the practiced grace of someone who'd sewn many seams, ground many herbs. She noticed things, where he stored the salt, how the woodpile was stacked. Jack found himself rearranging things after she touched them, not to fix her changes, but to make space for her presence. One evening, while the stew simmered and the fire cast their shadows against the wall, she spoke again. "You fought." It wasn't a question. Her eyes rested on the long scar that ran from Jack's temple to the base of his jaw. He nodded. "Long time ago. Still fighting, some days." "For what?" Jack stared into the flames. The question was too big, too old. He didn't answer. Later that night, she watched the fire and began to hum softly. A tune Jack didn't recognize. It wasn't a melody meant to entertain. It was older than that. A thread of memory, woven from dust and longing. It caught in the rafters of the cabin and stayed there, long after she'd fallen back into uneasy sleep. Over the next few days, something delicate began to form between them. Not trust, not yet, but the early bones of it. Jack taught her to handle the crossbow, though she needed little instruction. She showed him how to mix a salve from pine resin and snowmelt that eased the ache in his shoulder from an old bullet wound. They didn't talk much. Words were heavy, and in this world, Silence was a form of care. One afternoon, as Jack returned from checking traps along the ridge, he found her mending his coat. Not with coarse thread, but with sinew and skill. Her stitches were precise, nearly invisible. She looked up when he entered and offered no explanation. He said nothing either. Just set the rabbit he'd caught on the table and began skinning it. It struck him then, how quickly her presence had folded into his life. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It was changing, reshaping itself around this strange, quiet woman with storm-dark eyes and a soul that didn't flinch. Still, questions lingered. At night, Jack would watch her sleep, wondering who she had been before the snow, before the wolves, before she ended up bleeding in his arms. She never spoke of her past. He never asked. Some wounds needed silence more than salve. But the world beyond the cabin wasn't silent. A rider passed by on the second morning. Jack saw the man from the window, watched the way his eyes scanned the smoke rising from the chimney. The stranger didn't stop, but he saw, and knowing was enough. Later, while chopping wood, Jack paused and looked toward the trail. Leah stood at the edge of the trees, watching him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They both knew what was coming. That evening, Jack carved a new brace for the cabin door, reinforced the windows. He didn't tell her why. She helped without question. After dinner, she sat near the fire, her knees drawn up beneath the wool blanket he'd given her. Jack glanced at her, then at the rifle resting beside him. "They'll come," he said finally. She looked at him, steady. "They always do." He felt something shift inside him then, an echo of something he hadn't allowed himself in years, not hope, not yet, but the first breath of it, like the hush before a thaw. And in the quiet that followed, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small charm he'd carved long ago, a wolf's head made from bone. He set it on the table between them. She reached for it slowly, her fingers brushing his. Neither of them spoke, but for the first time since the scream in the snow, the cabin felt like a place worth defending. The snow hadn't stopped in 3 days. It came in long, slanting gusts that blurred the trees and swallowed sound, a white noise that erased the edges of the world. Jack Remington stood at the edge of his porch, coat drawn tight, eyes narrowed against the wind. He was staring down a path he hadn't walked in weeks, the trail to Silverton, a trail that now carried more than snow and silence. It carried tension. Leah stood behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence but not her warmth. She hadn't asked questions when he told her he needed to go into town. She simply packed a pouch of dried herbs, handed him a scarf she had stitched herself, and watched him saddle the horse without a word. But her eyes told him she knew. He didn't want to leave her, not even for a few hours. Not with the weight in the air, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. But supplies were running low, flour, bullets, oil, and they couldn't hide behind their walls forever. Silverton greeted him with narrowed eyes and stiff backs. It wasn't a loud thing. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. The kind of silence that follows rumors, fed by fear, stirred by those who need someone to blame. He walked through the general store like a shadow, choosing what he needed without lingering. The clerk, a boy named Levi who once shared whiskey with him on hunting trips, didn't meet his eyes. Jack felt it before he heard it, the shift in the air. "You ought to be careful, Remington." The voice came from the far end of the room. Carl Timmons, ex-soldier, ex-friend. Now just another man too full of fury and too empty of understanding. Jack turned slowly. "I usually am." Carl took a step closer, his smile sharp and ugly. "Word is, You're keeping company with someone don't belong here." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was its own kind of truth. "You think you can hide her forever?" Carl's voice lowered. "This town's got rules, Jack. We don't forget where folks come from." "Maybe that's the problem," Jack said. His voice was low, controlled, but inside something twisted tight. Carl's smile vanished. "Just remember, you pick her over us, you're picking war." Jack paid for his supplies and walked out without another word, but the eyes followed him all the way to the edge of town, judging, watching, waiting. The wind howled louder on his ride back up the mountain. When he returned, Leia was sitting near the fire, threading small beads into a strip of leather. She didn't ask how it went. She could read it in his jaw, in the tension in his shoulders. He set down the supplies, ran a hand through his hair, and finally said, "It's begun." She nodded once. "I felt it." They worked in silence after that, but it wasn't the kind of silence that divided. It was the kind that made them stronger. Jack reinforced the cabin door, adding a second bar across the frame. Leia boiled snow and filled glass jars with tonic. She mixed herbs that could blind, could burn, could save. Later that night, Ruth Mallory came. The widow rode up under cover of darkness, wrapped in layers and courage. Jack met her at the edge of the clearing, where the snow lay untouched. "They're meeting tomorrow," she whispered. "Carl's calling for a vote. If it passes, they'll come, maybe 20 men, maybe more." Jack stared out at the tree line. "How long do I have?" 2 days, if that she handed him a parcel, dried meat, salt, bullets. "For what's coming," she said. Then, before he could speak, she reached out and gripped his arm. "She's worth it, Jack. Whatever they say, I see it in you." He nodded once, throat tight. Ruth turned and disappeared into the dark, leaving behind only hoof prints and the scent of pine. That night, Leia stood by the window, looking out at the trees swaying in the storm. Jack joined her, their reflections faint in the glass. "They'll come," he said. "I know." "We can still leave." "No," she said simply. "I won't run again, not from them, not from this." Jack didn't argue. He didn't want to leave either, not anymore. He thought of the wolves, of the way she had bled into his hands, of the firelight in her eyes when she stitched his coat. He thought of how this cabin had once been a grave and was now something closer to a home. They spent the next day preparing. Jack dug trenches in the snow, hid traps beneath pine branches. Leia sharpened stakes and laced them with poison she'd made from berries and bark. They practiced loading rifles in the dark. They measured distances between windows, between trees. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where time slowed, and they simply stood near each other, shared a glance, a breath, a memory not yet made. Jack found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, not because he didn't trust her, but because he did. The night before the storm, Leia gave him something, a small charm, woven leather and beads, dark stones that glinted like stars. "What is it?" he asked. "A blessing," she said, "for courage." Jack took it in his hands, turning it over slowly. "I don't think I've had that in a long time. You've had it every day since you carried me through the snow." He tied it to his rifle. That evening, as darkness fell and the fire roared, Jack stood at the window watching the wind move through the trees. His heart was quiet, steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he finally knew what he was fighting for. The night came heavy and black, the kind that seemed to weigh on the shoulders of the world. In the cabin that stood like a scar on the side of the mountain, Jack Remington and Leia waited. There was no conversation left to have. Every word had already been spoken in glances, in the way their hands had moved together through the preparations, in the quiet steadiness of their breath. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach the edges of the room. Outside, the forest was holding its breath. The snow, once soft, now bore the weight of footfalls, shifting, cautious, deliberate. Jack knew that sound. It wasn't wolves this time, it was men. And worse than that, it was men who thought they were right. Oh, he looked at Leia. She was calm, unnervingly so. Her rifle rested in her lap, the charm she'd given him hanging from the barrel. Her eyes reflected firelight, but there was something older in them tonight. Something still and unshakable, like stone worn smooth by centuries of wind. The first knock didn't come. It was a shout. "Jack Remington, we know she's in there. This is your last chance." Carl Timmons. Jack stepped toward the door, heart hammering slow and steady. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He spoke through the wood, voice low and even. "She's not leaving." A pause. Then the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking. "You bring her out, or we'll come in and drag her out ourselves." Jack didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back and looked at Leia. Her grip tightened on the rifle. Her nod was slight, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. They had made their choice. The first shot came like thunder, splintering wood, shattering the air. Jack dropped to the floor, returning fire through the narrow window slit. The crack of his rifle echoed down the valley. A scream followed. Someone was hit. The night turned to chaos. Gunfire tore through the trees. Shadows danced along the cabin walls. Leia moved like she'd trained for this her whole life. Fluid, focused. She fired from the back window, covering the second path Jack had dug beneath the snow, a trench meant for retreat or ambush. It became both. One of Carl's men tried to circle wide. Jack waited until the crunch of his boots reached the edge of the trap, then fired a single shot. The man crumpled into the snow without a sound, but they kept coming. Torches flared between the pines. A bottle shattered against the cabin wall, fire spilling across the logs, hissing against the cold. Jack grabbed a pot of snowmelt and doused the flame. The smoke burned his lungs. And then, from the trees, came a sound that didn't belong to men. Howls, high, wild, close. Leia stepped out into the doorway, a bone whistle pressed to her lips, the same one Jack had seen her wear on a leather cord beneath her shirt. She blew once, twice, then again. The forest answered. From the dark, shapes emerged. Wolves. Not tame, not owned, but something older, something sacred. Jack froze as the pack moved past her, their eyes reflecting the firelight, their steps silent as death. Carl's men screamed. The wolves didn't kill indiscriminately. They scattered the mob, tore through their line with snarls and teeth, leaving terror in their wake. Men dropped weapons. Horses reared. Torches hit the snow and hissed into darkness. Carl stood at the center of it all, frozen. He lifted his rifle toward Leia, eyes full of fury. Jack didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, and Carl dropped like a felled tree, his weapon clattering uselessly to the frozen ground. The rest fled. Not all of them made it far. And then, just as quickly, the night grew still. Smoke curled from the edges of the cabin. Blood soaked the snow. Jack's breath came ragged and hard, his hands trembling. He looked at Leia. She was standing in the doorway, framed by flickering firelight. The wolves gathered behind her as if drawn to her gravity. She lowered the whistle. The wolves melted back into the woods. Jack moved to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. For the first time, he saw her not just as a woman he had saved, but as a force in her own right. A survivor. A fighter. Something wild and sacred. They stood there in the snow, surrounded by the remnants of what had tried to destroy them. Neither said a word. There was no victory to celebrate, no cheer, no triumph. But they were alive, and that was enough. Later, as the fire in the hearth grew steady again and the cabin settled into its bones, Jack sat on the floor, cleaning the rifle with hands that no longer shook. Leah sat nearby, wrapping her wounds with cloth and ash, the old way. Outside, the moon rose. Inside, something else did too. Not peace. That was too soon. But a promise, unspoken, unbreakable. The snow began to melt slowly, reluctantly, as if even the earth wasn't ready to let go of what had passed. Beneath the crust of ice, the first threads of green curled upward, timid, soft, almost apologetic. But they came all the same. Spring had found the mountain. Jack Remington stood by the river with his sleeves rolled up, hands cupped, beneath the cold rush of water. It moved faster now, fueled by thaw and memory, its voice louder than it had been in months. The kind of sound that seemed to scrub your bones clean. He stared at his reflection in the ripples. Older than he remembered, but steadier too. The kind of man who had chosen to stay and fight, not because it was safe, but because it was right. Leah knelt further upstream, gathering roots in her basket. Her hands moved with quiet grace, her fingers dirt-stained and sure. She hadn't said much since the attack. There had been nothing theatrical in her grief, no unraveling, no collapse. But something had shifted in her, just as something had shifted in him. They were different now. Still breathing, still standing, but different. It had been 9 days since the mob came. 9 days since fire licked the walls of the cabin, since gunfire lit the night like lightning, since wolves carved paths through the snow and fear scattered like ash. The bodies had been buried, deep in the earth, each one marked with nothing more than a circle of stones. It hadn't been forgiveness, just necessity. Even a man who came with hate in his heart had once been a child. When Jack had lowered Carl Timmons into the frozen ground, he hadn't felt triumph. He'd only felt tired. Back at the cabin, smoke curled once again from the chimney. It wasn't the frantic black of burning. It was steady now, warm and slow, the scent of cedar mingling with stew. They'd rebuilt what they could. The broken shutters had been replaced with stronger ones. The front door now bore a scar across its center, a reminder that even thick wood could be split by enough force. But it held. So did they. That morning, Jack had returned from Silverton for the first time since the fight. He went early, before most of the town had stirred. He wore his coat low, his hat lower, and spoke to no one except Ruth Mallory. She handed him a small sack without ceremony. Dried corn, flint, 2 spools of thread, and 3 seeds wrapped in waxed paper. "They'll try again," she warned softly. "I know," Jack said. "They'll send strangers next time, hired hands. Men who don't need reasons, only coin." Jack nodded, accepting it like weather. "Then we'll be ready." She placed her hand over his. "You already are." He'd ridden back with the sun on his back and the weight of the future in his saddlebag. Not fear, not anymore. Just the reality of what had to be done. Now, as Leah joined him at the water's edge, their eyes met. No words passed between them, but something else did. A shared knowing. A quiet vow. They walked back to the cabin in silence, their boots soft against the thawing ground. On the porch, Jack paused, pulling something from his pocket. A silver coin, dulled by time. It had belonged to his brother. A reminder of another life, another version of himself he'd long since buried. He turned it over once, twice, then stepped off the porch and walked back to the river. Without ceremony, he let it go. It hit the water with a soft plunk, vanished beneath the surface and didn't return. When he came back, Leia was waiting. In her hand, she held 2 narrow bands of leather, each threaded with beadwork, deep red and black and bone white, the colors of protection. She held one out to him. "A bond," she said, "if you choose it." Jack took it without hesitation, tied it around his wrist. Then, with fingers clumsy but careful, he tied the other around hers. It wasn't a promise of forever. Nothing was out here, but it was a promise of now. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for spring. Jack cleared space for a garden near the edge of the clearing. Leia crushed dried herbs into powder, storing them in small cloth bundles. They spoke little, but each movement carried meaning. A bowl placed closer to the fire. A touch at the elbow in passing. A pause in the doorway to wait for the other. The world hadn't forgotten them. They could feel it, like a shadow still waiting in the trees. But something had changed inside them. They were no longer surviving around each other. They were surviving together. That night, they sat by a fire, not of desperation, but of comfort. They ate simply: venison stew, flatbread, Leia had baked with cornmeal from Ruth's sack. Outside, stars pricked the sky, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called out into the dark. Jack leaned back against the cabin wall, arms folded, legs stretched toward the hearth. "I used to think this place would bury me," he said softly. Leia looked at him. "And now?" He smiled, the kind that came slow and deep. "Now, I think maybe it's where I start over." She reached for his hand, their fingers laced without hesitation. They didn't talk of tomorrow, or the day after. They didn't map out a future they couldn't predict. Instead, they sat in the hush between words, in the warmth of the fire, in the truth of what they had carved out from the cruelty of the world. Not a home. Not yet. But something dangerously close. When the wind rose again, it carried more than a warning. It carried the scent of thawing pine and damp earth, the murmur of seeds beginning to stir beneath the surface. The mountain would never be gentle. The world would never be safe. But they would face it together. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. In the heart of the San Juan Mountains, where winter bites deep and silence is louder than thunder, a man once lived who believed he had nothing left to give the world. Jack Remington had escaped to the edge of nowhere to bury his past in snow and shadows. A former soldier, he had seen the worst in humanity: betrayal, blood, the breaking of men's spirits, and he carried those memories like a second skin. The cabin he built was never meant to be a home. It was a tomb with a chimney. A place to survive, not to feel. A place to be forgotten. But fate, as it often does in places like the Wild West, came not with thunder or flames, but with a single cry in the night. A scream that tore through the wind and led Jack to a woman dying in the snow. That night, when he lifted Leia's broken body from the mouth of a wolf pack, he was also lifting a part of himself he thought long dead. Leia, a Navajo woman with scars far deeper than the ones that bled across her skin, didn't beg to be saved. She didn't thank him with words or glances. Instead, she survived, slowly, stubbornly. And in that survival, she challenged everything Jack believed about the world, about himself, about what it means to be human. Their bond didn't begin with romance or longing. It began with fire and frost, with the quiet ritual of trust being built from splinters and shared silence. Jack watched as she mended his coat with careful stitches, brewed healing salves from pine resin, and taught him that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it hummed like a lullaby beneath the weight of loss. But the world beyond their small cabin was not ready to let them live in peace. The town of Silverton, bound by old fears and older prejudices, saw in Leia not a woman, but a threat, and in Jack, a traitor. Whispers turned to warnings, and warnings turned to war. Men came with guns and torches, cloaked in righteousness, demanding justice for a crime never committed. Jack had a choice. He could give Leia up, let her disappear into the wilderness, or worse, into their hands. He could return to silence, to solitude, to safety. He chose to stay. They fought not for revenge, but for the simple right to exist. Together. They fought beside each other, one with the instincts of a soldier, the other with the ancient wisdom of survival etched into her blood. They fought with rifles, with traps, with the haunting cry of wolves called from the depths of the forest by Leia's bone whistle. When the smoke cleared and the blood cooled in the snow, they were still standing, not untouched, but unbroken. In the days that followed, they rebuilt, not just the cabin, but themselves. Jack returned to the town not with fear, but with resolve. And in the quiet of spring's arrival, they planted seeds, not just in the soil, but in each other. Seeds of hope, of renewal, of a life that no longer ran from the past, but stood firmly rooted in the present. Leia never became a symbol. She was never meant to. She remained exactly what she was, a woman who refused to be erased. Jack, too, did not become a hero in the grand mythic sense. He remained a man scarred by war and loss, who chose kindness over fear, love over hate, courage over silence. Their story, like so many stories from the frontier, is not one of fairy tale endings. The danger didn't vanish. The prejudice didn't melt with the snow. But what changed, what mattered, was that they no longer faced it alone. And that is what made all the difference. So, what can we, living in a world of modern roads and digital storms, learn from this? We learn that kindness is not weakness, that trust, especially across division, is not naive, it is revolutionary, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stay. Stay when it's hard, stay when we're afraid, stay when everything in the world tells us to run or to retreat or to turn away. We learn that love, real love, is not built on convenience or comfort, but on the choice to fight for one another in the face of fire. That healing doesn't come in sudden waves, but in the quiet rituals of daily survival, sharing a meal, mending a wound, sitting in silence by the same fire. We learn that no one is too far gone to be brought back, that no place, no matter how wild or broken, is beyond the reach of hope, and that every day, no matter how heavy the past, we have a chance to start again, to plant something new, to protect what's worth protecting. So if this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of Jack's solitude, the fire in Leia's resolve, the raw beauty of a love forged in defiance, then we ask you to stand with us. Subscribe to this channel. Help us tell more stories from the forgotten edges of history, where courage didn't come with applause and love, often came with a cost. Your support gives us the strength to dig deeper, to write longer, and to bring you more legends from the untamed corners of the Wild West. Because somewhere, out there, beyond the fences and the noise, someone is still listening for the sound of a wolf in the dark, and wondering if, this time, there will be someone to answer the call.